Hotep. My name is Molefi Kete Asante, and I'm the president of the Molefi Kete Asante Institute. I'm so happy to see you, and we are expecting, of course, our wonderful group of people who will come in on live stream, and hopefully we'll also have questions. But we're delighted that you're here today at 5535 Germantown Avenue in Philadelphia. I'm going to have a conversation with you, one that we have always had and we should always have. We need to have it because we have seen so many things that have happened in the African world. And we know that African people are under attack and have been under attack for over 400 years in one sector or the other, by one region of the world or the other. We have always had these experiences and we've always seen these things. So it's extremely important that we understand that we need to confront and deal with all issues as they come. Today I'm discussing Kevin Hart and the blackness of the ancient Egyptians. And let me just tell you that this is sort of a fun talk, but a deep and serious talk. The reason is because somebody called me up and said, and Michael Cord said to me, Dr. Asante, is Kevin Hart really, is he serious on this? And I said, well, you know, he's a comedian, but on this one, we don't have to say that he's wrong. Because, in fact, Kevin Hart is correct on this question. He made some statements about the ancient Egyptians being black and the Arab people in Cairo, who are now the dominant government of Egypt, said that he should be banned from coming to Cairo and giving any kind of presentation or performance, because he had the audacity to say that the ancient Egyptians were black people. But the brother is from Philly, and it's sort of a Philly thing. I said, well, let me go to the brother's defense, because on this issue, the brother is correct. And so we're going to explore that today. And I hope if Kevin is around that he makes sure that his people are doing a spectatorship of the live stream so that he can understand. Now, here's what the newspaper said. Kevin Hart criticized for allegedly saying Egyptians were black. Critics launch online movement to shut down his upcoming show in Cairo. And to be honest with you, I never heard anything about this until my colleague, Dr. Jabali Adi, said, did you read it? And then I said, oh, let me go I got to read it because he keeps me up on all these things. So this is what they're saying. They criticize him, right? But this is Kevin, Philadelphia Kevin Hart, all right? But look at the other one. Says there's a call to cancel Kevin Hart's comedy show in Egypt over Afrocentric views. Now, that's the first time I heard that he was an Afrocentrist, but that's okay. I mean, we'll take them as they come. So this brother says, he makes a claim. Now, some of you know that Egypt, and it's very hard maybe to see on your map, but that Egypt, which is in the northeastern corner of the map of Africa, that Egypt is on the continent of Africa. It's only on one continent. It is not in Asia. It is not in Europe. It's not in South America, not in North America. It's not even in Antarctica. Egypt is in the continent of Africa. So we know that right away. So that there's something about that idea that Egypt is in Africa, all right? So we're going to explore a lot of things today. Sheikh Anta Diop, you may have heard this name. We consider him the most important African scholar of the 20th century. He once said ancient Egypt was a Negro civilization. He's writing this in his book, The African Origin of Civilization. The ancient Egypt was a Negro civilization. The history of black Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt. And this is profound because what he's saying is that Egypt is to Africa just as Greece is to Europe and as China is to Asia. That Egypt is one of the key cornerstones, and I've added to that. I've said Egypt and Nubia are to Africa as Greece and Rome are to Europe, and as India and China are to Asia. You can't take African civilization anywhere unless you understand our classical civilization. So we have to understand what happened. Why did the Arabs believe that the ancient Egyptians were not black? Well, you can read The African Origin of Civilization and The History of Africa. The first book, African Origin of Civilization, was written by Sheikh Anta Diop, and the second book was written by me, The History of Africa. These two books really deal with this case very clearly and very seriously. But here's the thing. There is in 1791, a French traveler by the name of Constantine Volney traveled throughout Egypt. And when he came back, he wrote this. He says, "How is it that a people now forgotten discovered," these are the African people, the black people of Africa, "how is it that a people now forgotten discovered while others were yet barbarians the elements of the arts and the sciences, a race now rejected from society for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe." This is what he's asking other white folks. How is it that those people, they founded this, they were knowledgeable and wise and intelligent before any of the Europeans, before they were still barbarians, he says this. We'll come to the Arabs later because we got to get to them because they're the ones who are attacking Kevin Hart. And they're the ones who are denying the ancient civilization, black civilization of Egypt. Dr. Charles Finch, who is retired, I think, from Morehouse College of Medicine, wrote that it became clear to Wallace Budge. Wallace Budge was one of the older Egyptologists. He was a European guy who had written a lot about Africa, studied a lot in Sudan and in Ethiopia. And so Finch, who has written a lot also about ancient Africa, said it became clear to Wallace Budge that everything about ancient Egypt could be understood only by reference to Africa. You can't understand ancient Egypt by reference to Europe. You can't refer, and I've been to Egypt about 14 or 15 times. In fact, Carlton, who is in here, Sudan, he and I, we've been twice, and me and Jabali, we've gone. We've seen what is there. You can't refer to Europe in it. You can't refer to Asia in it. It's an African civilization. We know that, right? So Finch says, it cannot be understood only by reference to Africa. There was nothing fundamentally Asiatic about Egyptian culture. In 1920, Budge, in his massive and erudite Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, reversing a 100-year-old trend among European Egyptologists, and his own early opinion, classified Egyptian as being African rather than Semitic. This is what at the time, was considered one of the great Egyptologists of the world, people who study Egypt. And this was Wallace Budge. This is African civilization. And of course, now I don't need to go through all the African Americans who have looked at this, the African American scholars from Asa Hilliard, the great eminent Asa Hilliard, Yosef Ben Yochanan, J.A. Rogers, Maulana Karenga, William Leo Hansberry, John Jackson, you can name them, Anthony Browder, W.B. Du Bois, Willis Huggins, Charles Finch, John Henry Clark. There's a lot of brothers and sisters as well who have studied, who have looked at this and examined this question. So why do we come to this point, right now, to this point where the Arabs are saying to Kevin Hart, don't say that the ancient Egyptians were black-skinned. All right, we're going to deal with it. We got to deal with that. But before we deal with it, let's deal with the United States. There is the Office of Budget Management, the OBM, in the United States. Is a very, very powerful organization in the federal government. Most people don't know that that's how you get the classifications of races in the United States. They're the ones who classify races. There's no other institution in America. It is not done by the Department of Defense, not done by the Department of Education. It's the Office of Budget Management that tells all the other agencies in the United States government who's black and who's white. So what do they say about this? You can look it up. You just Google it. Office of Budget Management Directive 15. That's what it's called, Directive 15. Directive 15 classifies all the people in the United States. So who are the white people, according to the OBM? White is a person having origins in any of the original people of Europe, North Africa, or the Middle East. Tugu, you're a white man. Stand up and declare you're a white man. You're a white man. This is what they say. That if you're in the United States of America, you got to declare one. I mean, they will declare you in order to count you. And there are people in Sudan, and Libya, in Egypt, who declare themselves, I'm white. Because the Americans say, if you have the original people of Europe, North Africa, now don't be a West African like me and try to claim, no, you can't claim it. You're in North Africa or the Middle East. Now, meanwhile, there is no such thing as a Middle East. Middle East is a political designation. It's not a continent. There's no continent, Middle East. You're either in Africa or in Asia. And the so-called Middle East countries, for example, that they speak of are actually in Southwest Asia. They're Southwest Asia. Israel is Southwest Asia. You see? Egypt is Northeast Africa. These are the continents, Africa and Asia. Not no middle, there's no such thing. It's a political designation. And this notion of North Africa, and what the reason the white people in America did this, and I don't understand, I'm gonna say this to the Congressional Black Caucus, I don't understand why y'all don't change this designation. Yeah. These designations are racist, and they're incorrect. So you got black people in Congress who have been in Congress, and I've written to some of them, talked to some of them, who cannot figure out how to get the OBM to change this designation. And I'll tell you in a minute why I think they won't change it. But part of this is a problem, and that's what is in the minds of the Arabs and in the minds of the Turks and all other people who want to say, well, no, we're not like those people, right? So their thing is that America says that if you're born in North Africa or if you're born in the Middle East, you're white. That's it. It's there. It's very clear. It's problematic. Let me tell you why. Show you why it's problematic. You may not be able to see this well on your screen, but I hope you can see it. But if you can't see it well, you should look his name up. Mustafa Hefni. Mustafa Hefni. I've known this brother for maybe 25 or 30 years. He lives in Detroit. He's from Egypt. And when he came to America, he was persecuted because the Americans in the school district in Michigan wanted to claim that he was white. He said, no, I'm black. They said, no, but where are you from? He said, I'm Egypt. Said, where were you born? He said, I'm born in Port Said. They said, well, you born in north of Egypt, and you're from Egypt, you can't be black. Because Egypt is not black. So he wrote a book, and you can get his book called I Am Not a White Man, but the United States government is forcing me to be one. Right. What did you write? He said, no, I'm born in Egypt, but I'm black. Well, there are a lot of black people in Egypt. I've seen them. Those of us who travel there, we see them. You can go to their villages. The whole island of Elephantine is basically 3,000 black people. People in Komombo, black people. So where is this? What is it? What are the Arabs trying to do? I think the Arabs in Cairo are basically angry because they are what I call it. They are part of a particular type of government that is extremely crude. And here's what the government is. I call it a government that wants to change the language and the orientation of ancient Egypt. They don't want it to be a part of the continent to which it belongs. So they want to change it. So the idea about changing Egypt from being an African country is to say, well, the ancient Egyptians were not black. In fact, if you go to Egypt and if you study Egyptian history and culture or the Egyptian language, one of the things that you learn very quickly is that the ancient Egyptians, their orientation was to the south. They saw themselves as coming from the south. And that is reasonable since the Nile River, which is the longest river in the world, flows from the south to the north. It flows down to the Mediterranean. It doesn't flow from the Mediterranean into the interior of Africa. It flows from the interior of Africa, 4,000 miles down to the Mediterranean. So they looked upstream and they thought of Lake Tana in Ethiopia. They looked upstream and they thought of Uganda and Rwanda, the mountains of the moon. That's where we are from. They recognized their origin, and their origin was not at the Mediterranean. Their origin was from the interior of Africa. You see, they viewed themselves that way. Menes, the founder of Egypt himself, was from Upper Egypt. And sometimes people say Upper Egypt, you think of north. No, Upper Egypt means the south. Lower Egypt is the north. And that's the orientation. They saw that, you see. So when you read about Upper Egypt, you're reading about the southern, you're reading about Nubia, actually. You're reading about Sudan. You're reading about those are the areas from which the people who built the Egyptian culture came from. So this attack on Kevin Hart is really because people have little information. They don't know very much. And I found that when I've traveled in Kemet, but not in Egypt. But it's not just in Egypt. It's everywhere in the continent, and it's also in this country. People don't know very much about Africa. They have very little understanding. They don't know, for example, that the Greeks learned from the black Egyptians, that the black people in Egypt taught the Greeks geometry and mathematics and medicine, law and architecture and astronomy and philosophy and religion even. The first name of God was announced on the continent of Africa. No other people announced the name of God before the African people, you see. And in terms of just understanding this tradition, there are a couple of things I want to point out, because I'm going to get to the, because people want to know, well, how did the Arabs get to the point where they are saying that it was not black-skinned people who built Egypt? Well, they get to this point because of conquest. But conquest is a very interesting thing. And as you will see, I have some names for these conquerors and how they do it. But right now, let me just show you what we learned from Africa itself. And this is evidence from Strabo, one of the writers, ancient writers of Europe, said, for example, geometry was invented, it is said, from the measurement of lands, which is made necessary by the Nile when it confounds the boundaries of the time of its overflows. This science then is believed to have come to the Greeks from the Egyptians. Where's geometry from? The fact that the Nile overflowed its banks and destroyed different farms and lands, and you had to parcel out the land again after the floods. You had to divide it, measure it. So if you had to measure it, then you create drawing lines, you know what I'm saying? And making, if you had so many square feet before, or meters, then we give you the same amount, you see? That's where geometry came from. Anybody who tells you that the Greeks created geometry then must be lying, because the Greeks themselves say that they got it from Egypt. But look at this. Not only that, the science which relates neither to pleasure nor yet to the necessities of life were invented first in those places where men had leisure. Thus the mathematical sciences originated in Egypt, because there the priestly class had leisure. Who said that? The Greek Aristotle. Aristotle didn't say, I'm going to claim, as a Greek, I'm going to claim that we did this, we had it. No, he said, no. It came from Africa. He specifically said it in his book, Metaphysics. He writes this. So we know geometry and mathematics come from Africa. Egypt is in Africa. That's why I showed you the map. There's no other continent, you see. I mean, I know people are confused by that, because I spoke to a 7th grade class in Buffalo, New York a few years ago and asked them on which continent is Egypt, and they said Europe. So how do you think people come to that? I was discussing with Brother Barreto here earlier today about how people are miseducated. How somebody come with a thought that Egypt is in Europe, and they're in school. They're learning. They're going to be leaders, presidents and stuff, And this is the knowledge that they have. But then philosophy also comes from Africa. Thales, and that name you may not have heard of, but Thales was the first Greek philosopher. That means he's before Socrates, he's before Isocrates, he's before Plato, he's before Aristotle. He's the first Greek philosopher, Thales, right? Thales had no instructor except the Egyptian priest with whom he spent time in Egypt. That's according to Diogenes. That's what he writes. He says, even Thales The first of the Greek philosophers had no instructor except the black people. Who else instructed him in philosophy? Thales of Miletus made voyages to the priests and the astronomers of Egypt, and according to his biographers, he learned geometry from the Egyptians. He learned all kinds of things from the Egyptians, you see. So now, but I'm building up to you to tell you why the Arabs have taken a position that they have taken. They're taking the same position the Europeans took. Isocrates wrote in his book called Bucerus. He says, of whom Pythagoras of Samos, and we heard about the Pythagorean theorem, right, by Pythagoras. Pythagoras of Samos is one. On a visit to Egypt, he became a student of the religion of the people and was first to bring to the Greeks all philosophy, not just a little bit of it. He brought all philosophy, and more conspicuously than others, he seriously interested himself in sacrifices and in ceremonial purity. Who's writing about him? Socrates, who was a philosopher who lived after Pythagoras. He says Pythagoras, Thales, first philosopher of note of the Greeks. Pythagoras, second philosopher of note of the Greeks, and Pythagoras spent 22 years in Egypt. And what do they bring to Greece when they go back home? They brought philosophy. You can't even, so there's no discussion here. There's no argument. Even the Greeks themselves said it, and they laid it out. In fact, Herodotus said this about the Greek borrowing from Egypt. Melampus, who was a wise man, acquired the art of divination, having become acquainted with the worship of Bacchus through knowledge derived from Egypt, introduced it into Greece. That's why George G.M. James, a great African scholar who taught at the Black College in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, wrote the great book in the 1950s called Stolen Legacy. There is no Greek philosophy. There is only stolen African philosophy. That's right. And he proved it, line by line. Herodotus wrote also on the oracles of Dodona and Libya. And let me just say that this notion of the oracles was founded principally in Africa itself. That is where particularly leaders of nations would go to the temples, and they would speak to the priests and the priestesses at the temples. And the priests and priestesses at the temples, through the magic of their voices, would speak to them. This may even be where the Catholics got, where you go do the confessions and talk to somebody and somebody talks to you back. Well, those are the oracles. That's what the oracles were like, that, you see. But what we know about them is that Herodotus, who was a Greek historian in the 5th century, says, this was what I heard from the priest of Waset. Waset is a city in Egypt that today they call Luxor. Waset is one of the most ancient cities in the whole world. That's where the Temple of Karnak is. We've been there many times. He says, at Dodona, however, the women who deliver the oracles relate the matter as follows. Here's what they say about it. 2 black doves flew away from Egyptian Waset, from Luxor, and while one directed its flight to Libya, the other came to them in Greece. So even the oracles in Greece just like the ones in Libya, came from these black doves, these women. And in fact, he goes on to talk about the sound of their voice. Two of the sacred women, priestesses, were carried from Waset by Phoenicians. One was sold into Libya and the other into Greece. And these women were the first founders of the oracles in the two countries. The most religious, at the very basis of religion, two black women. One for Greece, one for Libya. This is a fact. Herodotus writes this in the book Histories. Ancient Egyptians and what I call assemblies. I once heard someone give a talk about commencement exercises. And they said, well, you know, the commencement exercise starts with the medieval Europeans when they would dress in their robes and they would march in and so on, coming from the monasteries. It's not true. It's not true. They used to say that all the time, even at temple. I've been in college ceremonies and heard people say that, deans and assistant deans, associate deans, give this false information. That's why when you're talking about miseducation, why people don't know, because they didn't read the text. Here's what the text says. The Egyptians were the first to introduce solemn assemblies. Nobody did it before them. Solemn assemblies, where you get people together and you got music, drums, and parades, and assemblies where people are praising the deities. The first one, where it first happened in Africa, didn't happen anywhere else before. They also were the first to introduce processions and litanies to the gods of all which the Greeks were taught the use by them. It seems to me, according to Herodotus, sufficient proof that in Egypt these practices are from remote antiquity, while in Greece they are only recently known. And this was in the 5th century BC. He said we just know them right now. But they're from remote antiquity, means maybe 2,500 years ago, maybe 2,000 years ago, maybe 3,000 years ago. The authorities also say, this is what Herodotus says, the authorities also say that the Egyptians were the first to use the names of the 12 gods, and that the Greeks took these from them, and that the Egyptians were the first to assign altars and images and temples to the gods and carve figures out of stone. Herodotus, book 2 again. This is the first. When I first heard the name Herodotus, you know what they used to say at UCLA? Herodotus was the father of history. But after Afrocentrists, real Afrocentrists, start using Herodotus, they say, you know, Herodotus misinterpreted a whole lot of stuff. And he didn't know what he was talking about. You know what I mean? So I get Herodotus. The father of history is no longer the father of history for Europe, because he's giving people all this information. And, you know, it's information that was already in the books. They knew it because he wrote in the 5th century BC. That's before Christ. So that's that's like 2,500 years ago. He's writing this, and he left it, and they use him. And then now they don't want to use him. Now, Lady Lugard, who was the wife of the governor of Nigeria in early 1900s, in 1906, she wrote a book called A Tropical Dependency, which for a long time was considered a very famous book in West African history. She says the influence of civilization spread from Ethiopia to ancient Egypt and thence to Europe. This lady who had traveled to Africa had come to the conclusion from what she could find that the influence of civilization spread from Ethiopia to ancient Egypt. And this is what John Jackson writes in his book, Introduction to African Civilization, that the influence of civilization spread from Ethiopia to ancient Egypt and thence to Europe. She writes that at the remote period of history, the leading race of the Western world was a black race. This is what the white woman says. Now y'all know how y'all respond to that. You know, I'm not saying, she said it, right? She said but why would she put the leading race of the Western world? That's what I didn't understand. No, the leading race of the world was a black race. But the problem is that we don't read these things. The Egyptians called themselves Kemetu, and their land Kemet. The word Kemet means the black land. That's what it means. In the ancient Egyptian, the word Kemet means the black land. The name of the people, Kemetu, means literally the blacks. That's what it means. The Kemetu. They use the word Kenti, Khenti, for people who live south of them in other parts of Africa. It is the same word, but it's the same word that they would use for the word first. When you say first one, the beginning, the origin, the word is Kenti. Kenti, the first, the beginning, the origin. That word the ancient Egyptians used for the most ancient of people. The black people, the Kenti, of who were living south of them, upstream in the river, you see? One word for inner Africa they used was Yao. Y-A-W, Yao, means old or ancient. It's the same as their word for old, making inner Africa the old country of immigrants. Inner Africa also was Tanecha. Tanecha, meaning the land of the gods. That's what they call it. Where are you going? Tanecha. Where are you coming from? Tanecha, the land of the gods. Everything about the interior of Africa evoked in the Egyptians a sense of awe, reverence, and nostalgia. But what happened? I'm not going to go through this in detail. One day I'll give a lecture on this in more detail, the invasions of Africa. But the invasions of Africa, this is what began to change things. Let me tell you just quickly, run through these. The Hyksos, who came in and were kicked out around 1500 BCE. The Assyrians who came in. The Persians who came in. The Greeks under Alexander who came in around 333. The Romans who defeated the Greeks. You remember when Cleopatra was killed, by the Romans. So 30, that was around 30 BC when Cleopatra was killed. So the Romans took over then and run Egypt as a colony from Rome for almost 400 or 500 years until the African people, the original people in Egypt, asked, this is what we did. We asked the Arabians to come over to Africa and help us defeat the Romans. That's the history people don't realize, right? So you think, how did the Arabs get there? They got there in 639, this era, AD. 600, so they've been there a long time, but 639 AD. They came over because the Romans had this occupation of Egypt. And the idea that the Africans had was if we could organize with the Arabs to throw off the Romans, we could then have our independence. So what did they do? Under the authority of the Arab general, his name was General E.L.L. Oz, A.S. You can look him up, General L. Oz. He was the one who had defeated Jerusalem. And when he had defeated Jerusalem, the Africans said, well, come on down here, and since you warriors, Come on down here with your Islamic warriors and let's throw out the Romans. They threw out the Romans and then decided that they wouldn't go home. They said, you know, this is a good place. They got all kinds of fruits and vegetables along the Nile River. You know, people got cattle and stuff. It's not desert where, I mean, if you go to Egypt and you're flying in the air, you look down, Egypt is a strip of green along both sides of the Nile River. And on the other side is deserts on both sides. So it's like, wow, here's a country you can go for hundreds of miles and it's just fertile, green. They got every plant and fruit you can think of, all the animals you can think of in this green valley, you see. So they said, why should we leave here? So in 641, the Arabs built a fortress and they named it Cairo. Cairo was the first city built. The Arabs didn't build the cities of ancient Egypt. They didn't build Waset. They didn't set up the pyramids. They didn't build the temples of Egypt. They built Cairo. And they made Cairo the citadel and the fortress for their penetration throughout Egypt into other regions, taking over the Africans' land. That's how this happened. So that's why I have here for you the invasions. After the Romans, the Arabs came. But the Arabs, when they came, because they were Muslim, they also had to submit to the Ottoman Turks, because the Turks came. While the Arabs were in Egypt, the Turks came and took the power from the Arabs and then extended their power even into Sudan. I'm pretty sure they were close to Sudan, to Darfur. They established all kinds of places throughout Africa, you see. And then, of course, the Turks, they were attacked by the Western Europeans, the French and the British. And most people don't realize this, that after the World War, the first international European war, you had the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was taken over by the French and the British. And the French also invaded, Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1799. And he didn't stay long because the British took over from him. But while he invaded, his soldiers found the Rosetta Stone. That's the stone that had the 3 different writings, languages on them that allowed people to decipher the ancient texts, you see. But the point that I'm making here is that the Ottomans lost their whole empire after World War I. And when they lost their empire, 2 Europeans divided up their empire. Sykes, S-Y-K-E-S, and Picot, P-I-C-O-T. Picot, Sykes and Picot. We always talk about the Berlin Conference, 1884 and 85. That's good because that's what divided up Africa. But what divided up the Ottoman Empire, that made Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, et cetera, was a Sykes-Picot agreement between the French and the British, you see. So Egypt was essentially left alone until, of course, the British, as I said, the British were in charge, and they were in charge of a population that had been mixed with Turks and Greeks and all the other Persians, all the other people who had invaded Greece. So what we see, and then of course, when the overthrow of the king that had been set up by the British happened, the person who took over was Nasser. General Nasser, a military man who was Arab, became the leader of Egypt. But Egypt in antiquity was not an Arab country. Egypt in antiquity, meaning in the most ancient times, was black. And the farther back you go, the blacker Egypt gets. So you're talking. So I'm gonna show you. I'm show you some images. But I want to let you know this because you got this. If you know this, you understand that Imhotep was not an Arab. Hatshepsut was not an Arab. Ramses II was not an Arab. King Tutankhamun was not an Arab. They were black people. They were black-skinned people. So when you understand that, you understand that both ancient Egyptians and Nubians were the same people, same complexion, same skin people. The integration of the Arab population into Egypt was what I call a subterfuge host. This is a new term for you. A subterfuge host is somebody who uses deceit to carry out particular activities. Subterfuge. I'm going to give you quick examples. I'm going to be real quick on this. United States of America. Do you think the population of the United States of America today is like it was 600 years ago? There were indigenous people here. We own the land of the Lenape. Where are the Lenape? These are the ancient people. The ancient people were Lenape. So the white people in America are like a subterfuge host. You come in, you take over the land, you rename it. You rename the rivers, rename the mountains, rename the cemeteries of the people. You take over everything. Subterfuge host. Mexico, the same way. We used to go to Mexico and say, where are the black people in Mexico? Because we know it was a slave colony. Where are the black people? We don't have black people here. We're all mestizos. But there had to be black people here somewhere, sometime. Where are the black people? And then we go and we find them. There are like 300 or 400 villages of black people still living in Mexico, particularly in Oaxaca. So he said, why are these people shown? What is this? Because the Spaniards are subterfuge hosts. They took over the land of the indigenous people, you see? And then they wiped out their history so that many times today, many of the Mexicans are confused. They don't even know that they have African ancestry. They would deny that they have indigenous ancestry. Oh no, I'm not an Indian. I'm not indigenous. No, I'm not an Apache. I'm not. Wait a minute. What are you? You're not Spaniard. You didn't come from Spain. What is this thing? You see what I'm saying? But this is the mentality, because the subterfuge host has taken over the minds. But John Henry Clark was right when he said that they not only conquer the land, they conquer the mind. And they conquer information about the land. So you have a situation like in Australia, it's the same way. I've been to Australia. You go to Australia and you see, where do you see the black? Australia would have been the second biggest black continent on the face of the earth had the Europeans not went there, gone there, right? And to take over and kill the people. They have sporting events, shooting down black people in the streets. going out into the range and just go hunting for Sunday and shoot black fellows. So when you see the black fellows, as I've seen, it seems like they're a broken people. Alcoholism, violence against women, juvenile problems. These people have their own continent. A subterfuge host came in, took over, destroyed their culture, their rituals, their ceremonies, their sacred spaces and places. So that's what Egypt is. That's where you come to the Arab population. Subterfuge host. That's why they have no respect for the antiquity of Egypt. I've talked to many Egyptians, many Arab Egyptians about it. Very little respect for the pyramids. Very little respect for the temples and the great sculptures and architecture. They want to destroy and bomb them because this has nothing to do with Islam. This is pagan. Africans go there with a sacred attitude, with awe and inspiration that our ancestors have built the greatest, most majestic civilization in antiquity. And the Arabs see it as a payday. How can we get more money out of these Americans and foreigners? How can we tell them that we got a discovery yesterday or 2 days ago that we already had in the museum so that we can get more of them to come here and give money to something that we don't even respect ourselves? No, this is subterfuge. And this is why they changed the names. Waset is a beautiful name, the city of 1,000 gates. Well, why were you going to change the name of Waseti, the city of power and splendor? And they said, no, we're going to call it Luxor. Well, why would you change? And well, the Greeks did the same thing. The Greeks called it Thebes. Same city, Thebes. The city of Mennefer. The great city of Mennefer, which if you go there now, it is nothing but vacant land. It was wiped off of the face of the earth. It was the greatest city of its time. The capital of Kemet, Mennefer. And now they call it Memphis. That's where we get Memphis, Tennessee from, you see. It's a Greek name. It's not Mennefer, but the Greeks went there and they said, we want to change it to Mennefer. So anyway, I'm coming to an end. But this is a little more. I got to show you some pictures. You got to see some pictures before you can do this. Khufu's pyramid is perhaps the most colossal single building ever erected on the planet. 2600 BC. 2,600 years before Jesus Christ. There is no Jesus Christ, no memory, no thought of Jesus Christ, no thought of Buddha, no thought of Muhammad, no thought of any of them or that. 2,000 years before. Africans wasn't sitting around waiting. Well, 2,500 years from now, Jesus is going to come. Oh. You know, they wasn't sitting around thinking in 2600 BC that in 622 Muhammad would come. No. They're not thinking like that. They built for eternity. The Arabs arrived nearly 2,000 years after the first pyramid was built. That's as long it is from here back to Jesus. 2,000 years. The gap between when the black people built the pyramids and the Arabs came. And then they're going to tell Kevin Hart that they were not black. These were not black people. Well, they certainly were not white, and they were not Arabs. Aeschylus in the Suppliants has the character Danaus say of an Egyptian ship. I can see the Egyptian crew with their black limbs and their white tunics. This is 480 BCE. He's writing. I can see them. Herodotus says it is a fact that the Colchians are an Egyptian race because like them they have black skin and woolly hair. Herodotus says that. Book 2, chapter 104. That the Colchians, this is another people, are an Egyptian race. Now I had a question about that Egyptian race because in the language of Herodotus, in the Greek, the word ine Egyptica phile means something. I mean, is translated. It's translated in the European languages, like in French, it's translated as race. Ils sont de race Egyptian, and it's translated in Egyptian. I mean, in English, the Egyptian race. But I changed the translation. They are Egyptians because, like them, they have black skin and woolly hair. Because I don't think that the word race was used by Herodotus in 480 or whatever BC. Right. That who would come up with that notion of race? That's a modern notion. He probably said ine Egyptica, but they put in this word phile to say basically race. But no, this is so we got to look at everything. We got to challenge everything, because they create all these things that mislead people. But this is part of our problem. Herodotus says the oracle of Donanan. Okay, and when they added that the dove was black, they give us to understand that the woman was black. That's when you remember I told you about the priest, and the priestesses of Donana. Now Herodotus, it makes it clear the oracle of Donana of Epirus, which according to legend was Egyptian in origin, was founded by a black woman. And when they add that the dove was black, they give us to understand that the woman was black. All right? Aristotle says, speaking derogatorily about Egyptians, say those who are too black are coward, as witness the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. The word "too" I translate sometimes as very. You are very, because Aristotle, just quickly, Aristotle was always talking about what the median, the mean. That you have to be not too black, not too white, the mean. And his whole idea was that males were, from Greek males, were more in the mean. They were not too white. They were not like the Egyptians and the Ethiopians, very black. But he used that word because he knew that the Egyptians and the Ethiopians were the same. They were black. So he didn't have a problem with it. And remember that when Herodotus said this in his book, Physiognomy, that what he was he was not making a description, he was really making a derogatory statement, but it gave us the idea that he understood that the Egyptians were black people and they were black skinned. All right? Lucian, on the other hand, presents a dialogue, he's another writer, between Lycinus and Timoleus, and has Lycinus saying of an Egyptian boy, the boy is not merely black, he has thick lips and his legs are too thin. His hair worn in a plait behind shows that he is not a freeman. He's not a free man, all right? So again, blackness, okay? Apollodorus says that Egyptos conquered the country of the black-footed ones and called it Egypt after himself. So this is again blackness. Queen Ty. That's how they depicted Queen Ty. She looked just like the sisters in this audience, right? Queen Ty. Most powerful woman, in my judgment, of the 18th dynasty. She had been the wife of Amenhotep III, who was the richest king that Egypt had had up until that time. She was the mother of Akhenaten. She was the grandmother of Tutankhamun. She made another one of her grandsons king, and when his time was up, she chose the king Ai was his name, Ai. They chose him to be king of Kemet. This is how powerful she was, Queen Ty of the 18th dynasty. This is Mentuhotep II. Mentuhotep II, you can look him up, very powerful king who actually reorganized Kemet, the whole country, brought it back together after it had fallen into disarray and chaos. Mentuhotep II, one of the great kings of Egyptian history. All right. This is King Tutankhamun. If you go to Cairo, unless they have hidden it away, you go to, because I was there and there was a big discussion in front of these statues. The two statues of, black statues of King Tutankhamun in the Cairo Museum, and there was a white lady asking an Arab guide, why are these statues black? And this one, I have to say, I have to give this Arab guy credit. He says, ma'am, because they were black. Amen. He was black. What's your question? What is this? He's a black man. So what are you? She couldn't understand this King Tut. Shouldn't King Tut be different? You see, and this is Nefertari, an image of Nefertari, the great wife of Amos, who led the beginning of the 18th dynasty. You see. So there are many pictures. This is images of the Egyptian musicians on the walls of the temples. Now, there's also a confusion. There's a confusion. I tell you, there's another confusion that we have to be aware of. And this is what people will do to you if you don't know. They will show you examples of white pharaohs. You know why? Because in the Metropolitan Museum of New York City, their largest collection is of the pharaohs who were under the Greek and Roman period. So you have to say, yes, of course there were Greek and Roman pharaohs. But what they do to people, what's confusing to people is people say, you say the ancient Egyptians were black, but I saw in the Metropolitan Museum that they had some figures that they look white. Yeah, the invaders were there. But the thousands of years of ancient history in Kemet are the blackest you can ever find anywhere. They're the black people, just like the people of Sudan, just like the people of Ethiopia, just like the people of Chad. These are black people, you see. So this is, but you have to know your history to know that the Metropolitan Museum in New York is different from the Brooklyn Museum. Now, if you go to the Brooklyn Museum in New York, you see the black figures, you see, because they collected different Europeans collected different things. They had different excavations, and they brought out different things. And those who concentrated on the Greek period or the Roman period will largely have mummies and images that come from that period. The god Hapi of the Nile River. The river Nile flows from two sources. I'm sorry, you can see that picture. But the civilization of ancient Egypt was created by people who are physically as dark as me and Kevin Hart. Leave the brother alone. Let him speak based on information in various books and from many authorities. So I'm going to just stop here. This is for those of you who don't know, this is our support page. If you're interested in it, donation. Our Cash App is $MKA Institute, and our PayPal is yaninga2@aol.com, and so forth. But I am finished for now, and we do have time for about 3 or 4 questions. Thank you very much. There's Reverend Joe, how you doing, sir? Thank you so much.
In my house, we couldn't use the word lie because I don't know why we couldn't do it, but I know one thing: white folks have no trouble lying.
They've been lying a lot.
I went to Egypt, 1990. Our tour guide, I asked him. I said, "Who built these pyramids?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Hold it." Now it's cost me $3,000 to get over here. You can't lie to me like that. Get us another tour guide, which they did. They did. And the other thing being, I heard on the radio, it was lying back then. They're still lying now.
Yes.
The radio said jazz was founded in China. I said, Jesus.
Jazz was founded in China.
In China.
Lord.
I mean, it just happened. I ain't talking about no 2,000 years ago. This happened last week.
I'm telling you.
On a 50,000 watt white station. So I tell you, do we need to be here this afternoon? Yes, sir,
yes,
we do.
We have to.
So we're passionate for lack of information or misinformation. They do it either way. They lie to you or give you the wrong story, whatever it might be. So thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
And this young man, where'd he go? This young man back here, he looked like a high school student, but he's a Dr. Smith was at our church this morning. I had to call 911 to find
Yeah, Doctor, would you tell us briefly about the story of Al-Sar and Al-Set? Just briefly.
Yeah, basically the story of Al-Sar and Al-Set is the creation story at the beginning for ancient Africa. In fact, it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, creation story. Is that when the divinity created the universe, the first creation was actually one that brought into existence what we call Geb and Nut. Then after, and this is the earth and the sky, you see, and that from this creation, there was the creation of water, you see, moisture, and so ultimately those creations gave birth to human creations, or Al-Sar and Al-Set, that the Greeks call Osiris and Isis, and also to Set and to the sister of these three, and that sister was my memory is escaping me here, but I will get Nephthys. Nephthys, the Greeks called her, and Nebhet, the ancient Egyptians called her Nebhet. Okay, so you had Al-Sar, which is Osiris, Al-Set, which is Isis, and you had Set, and you had Nebhet. These were the four humans created. And actually Set is said to have killed his brother, Osat, Osar, and to kill Osar and to cut him up into 14 pieces, spread his body around the world. And but in this process, Isis, or Set, gave birth to a child, a son, who was called Horus, who actually, in the Kemetic language, we say Heru. And Heru grew up actually in struggle with his uncle Set. That began the human story of the time. But all of this supposedly happened in the time, before there was time recorded. This was all going on. And you see the inscriptions on the walls of the temple that will tell you that this is what the battle was and this is what the struggle was. So Osar is, some people say Osar has the characteristics of the Christian notion of Jesus, in the sense that he was resurrected from the dead. You see, that he was resurrected and stood up on the side and stood up on the side of the river Nile and called, in the ancient language, the Great Resurrection. That was the name of Osiris, the Great Green One, the Great Resurrection. So, but then there are others who say that Heru, Horus, was the identification of Jesus. That Horus became the image, the model for the later stories that would come with the creation of Jesus, you see. Yes, sir.
So you have a question from your YouTube audience, Robert H. He asked, when you were talking about the classification of race, as far as white in Africa, North Africa, he asked, where is the African Union on this subject?
Well, the African Union, I don't know where they are on that subject, but they probably are confused too. And I said that way because I've dealt with the African Union on several occasions, and there's some confusion there. But let me tell you, the confusion starts with the United States, I think, because if the African Union accepts the theory of the United States of America, then that's the real problem. The United States is simply trying to separate the great classical civilizations of Africa away from the rest of the African continent, sort of to behead African civilization. And the African nations, through African Union, are not sufficiently Afrocentric, that they are aware of these kinds of subterfuges. And that's my problem with the African Union. I mean, they don't seem to understand that the aim and the goal of the American white supremacist doctrines are always at putting Africa at a disservice and a disadvantage. And this notion of the idea that that Northern Africa is white is not. I mean, I don't mind, for example, Arabs saying that they are white. If they want to say they're white, that's fine. But if you're born in North Africa, it doesn't mean that you're white. So that's a different thing. And I think that the idea of making sort of a blanket statement like that is an attempt to minimize Africa and to destroy African people. And the African Union needs to be more out front. But the African Union is, I think I gave a talk on this before. The African Union is compromised. When you have like 70% of your budget coming from Europe, how can you speak truth to Africans? It's a difficult situation. But they should never be in that position because they have rich countries in Africa. Why do we have to depend on Europe to support our organizations for Pan-African unity. What is that about? I don't understand that. I guess I'm always a person believing self-sufficiency. I don't understand why you go to your enemies and you ask your enemies, we want to have a Pan-African organization. Will you give us money to do it? And you, Nigerians, listen to me, Nigerians, Ethiopians, South Africans, Ghanaians, all these countries, and Gabon particularly, the richest country per capita on the face of the earth. Why can't y'all support your own organization? That I don't understand. Okay? All right, thank you so much. Is that it? Yes, sir, Brother Coleman Holmes.
Quick question, sir. The obelisks that we see, a couple of them in Rome in front of the Pope's palace, I believe, and the one that was recreated in Washington, D.C. Are you aware of any relationship between those monuments and this ancient history of the creation story of our ancient ancestors?
Well, that's a good point. This question he's asking about is what he calls the obelisk that you see in Rome and you see in London and Paris and New York, other parts of the Istanbul, probably other parts of the world, and Washington, D.C., a model, a copy. Do they have anything to do with Africa? Yes, they have to do with Africa. Well, some people argue that it is a story of resurrection, but the notion of the they were really called Tekken, the Tekkenu. They were called Tekkenu. These Tekkenu that were really proliferated by Hatshepsut, Queen Hatshepsut. If you go to the 18th dynasty, where she built scores of these Tekkenu, they were also popularized because they also were sort of announcements of the great power and majesty of the kingdom. Now, some people associated, I haven't seen this association in the literature, associated with, the erection of the male penis. But I don't know whether that's a fact or not, but that's what people argue. I've heard people argue that. But here's the thing. The thing is that Ethiopia, if you don't know, Ethiopia had, in Aksum, had over 1,600 obelisks. So, and if you go to Ethiopia, as I did about 4 years ago, you will see in Aksum huge obelisks, just as the size and power of the ones in Kemet that are there. I mean, and they have not been protected as they should be too. That's another reason. And this is not the Islamic not protecting like in Egypt. This is the Christians not protecting the obelisk in Aksum, because the Christians don't care for them either, because they see them as pagan. It was before Christian era, you see. So that's how people do in politics and government. I mean, they say, well, you know what? These things have been here so long, but they don't have anything to do with us. So we're not going to protect them. We're not going to clean them up. We're not going to make them nice, and so forth. And so all religions do that, because one religion subverts another one, and another one comes and subverts that one, and they start a whole new age. That's the thing that has happened. But they are this, right? Brother Mangaliso.
Yeah. Thank you for the lecture. Professor Walter Williams said in the 330 religions, they talk about the Greeks were writers of books. And Walter Williams said they didn't write those books because they didn't have an alphabet.
Well, the Greeks didn't?
Yeah. That's what Walter Williams said. 330 religions.
Yeah, the question is the Greeks didn't write in the books because they didn't have any alphabets. I disagree with that. I don't know who said that, but that's not true. The Greeks did write books.
They came with the ability to write books when they came into Egypt.
Well, now we got a whole nother discussion. the early development of the Greek text coming from the Greek Isles early on didn't come right away with books, but about 800 BC, you get the rise of Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And they may not have been written down initially at first, but they were written later in Greek. So you have to give credit to the Greeks for doing this. But 800 BC is young compared to the teachings of Ptahhotep, which go back to 27 or 2800 BC. See, almost 2,000 years before the Greeks. But we don't have to take everything from them, because they did do something after they learned from the Egyptians. So you have to give them that. All right, thank y'all so much, and see y'all February the 12th. February 12th, Dr. Iman. February the 12th, Dr. Iman on psychology and black oppression. Thank you very much. So how many did we get?